Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us, by the way, on Twitter at twitter.com/UNCknowledge. Twitter.com/UNCknowledge. Since earning a doctorate in international relations from Oxford, author and journalist Claire Berlinski has lived and worked in Britain, Thailand, Laos, and France. She now lives in Istanbul. Her most recent book, There Is No Alternative: Why Margaret Thatcher Matters, has just been released in paperback. A contributor to the new website, ricochet.com, Claire is visiting the United States, taking a time away from her home in Istanbul and her 7 cats.
7 cats.
You'll have some explaining to do about that. Today on Uncommon Knowledge, Margaret Thatcher, the war on radical Islam, Turkey, and the international woman of mystery, Claire Berlinski. Segment 1, Margaret Thatcher's achievement. Margaret Hilda Thatcher, daughter of a greengrocer, became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1979, remaining in office for 11 years until 1990. Briefly, describe Britain before Mrs. Thatcher took office.
Britain was considered the sick man of Europe. The winter before she came to power was the winter of discontent, where Britain was crippled, absolutely paralyzed by labor unrest. Britain was shoddy. The workforce was considered one of the worst in the developed world. The Russian trade minister told his counterpart, "We don't want to do business with you because your goods are terrible and you never deliver on time." So this
a Russian saying your goods are too shoddy for us.
The Soviet trade minister said, "We don't want to do business with you."
Standard of living had fallen beneath that of Italy.
Yeah, between the end of the Second World War in 1979, this is what had become of Britain, and people were extremely aware of it. But within the British Conservative Party, there was really no one who was willing to say this must be completely reversed. There was a sense of, we can manage this. Mm-hmm. We can manage Britain's decline. We can accommodate. We can somehow come to a compromise with the trade union, but there's no way of rolling this back. And that's where Margaret Thatcher comes in.
All right. In There Is No Alternative, you quote Mrs. Thatcher's advisor, John Hoskins, who says, when she took office, Mrs. Thatcher understood, quote, that something terrible had to be done. Explain.
Well, Hoskins is a very interesting figure, an unappreciated figure. I think he was really the architect of the Thatcher Revolution. He was looking systemically at everything that was wrong with the British economy and trying to figure out what would need to be changed for this to be reversed. And he came to the conclusion just about everything. Just about everything at that point.
You quote him as saying, if you change anything, you have to change everything.
Yes, yes.
It's also interconnected.
Exactly. And he drew the famous to me, maybe I'm the entire audience to whom it's famous, but he drew the wiring diagram, which is an incredibly labyrinthine, elaborate diagram showing how every part of the problem was connected. And he said, if we're going to change this, if we're going to make it better, we are going to be brutally unpopular. We're not going to be able to do this through consensus politics. It's impossible. This is going to be painful. We are going to have enemies. It is going to be a war. That's the words he used to me. And it's going to be terrible, but it is the only alternative, because if we do not do this, Britain's decline will be permanent. And it won't be gradual anymore, because it will reach a point where it will spiral out of control, and you will have not just relative decline, but absolute decline.
Mm-hmm. In There Is No Alternative, Claire, you look at several of these terrible measures in detail. Let's take a look at a couple of them. Of course, all of this is television standards, so everything has to be brief. This is a marvelous book, and anyone who wants to sink into it, get the book. But one of the terrible measures, the 1983 Falklands War. Explain why she cared about those islands 3,000 miles away from Britain.
Because it was sovereign British territory, and it was invaded by a tin pot dictator on grounds that made absolutely no sense. The grounds on which Galtieri invaded were, it's next to us.
Right.
Imagine if every country decided that it was entitled to invade every country that was next to us on the grounds, it's next to us.
But as formidable a figure as Jeane Kirkpatrick, American ambassador to the United Nations, leaned toward letting Galtieri get away with it.
Well, you might be able to explain why that is better than I can. My understanding was that there was considerable worry that all of South America would be destabilized, and that would allow communist inroads. But tell me, why? You were there.
Well, actually, I didn't have access to Mrs. Kirkpatrick's, Ambassador Kirkpatrick's deeper thinking, but she was very impressed by maps. She simply thought it makes more sense for this to be Argentine than British. And I also, my own feeling is that she was, at that point, people were still taking the measure of Mrs. Thatcher.
They certainly were.
And so the notion that Britain, which was, as you described, this had become this sort of second-rate, third-rate power, lacked self-respect, let alone a formidable. And then, by the way, okay, so hold on, you have me answering questions here, but give the military analysis that Mrs. Thatcher was presented with.
And actually, I really do want to know the answer to that question because I've often wondered this. A lot of people think, in retrospect, that it was a walkover. It wasn't. The British Navy was in no way prepared for this. It was prepared to fight in concert with NATO. It was prepared to fight the Soviet Union. It was not prepared for a naval battle in those climate conditions in South America, 4,000 miles away from the nearest
4,000 miles, right.
from the nearest airbase. And almost no one was telling her that it was possible. Her own advisors, her military was saying, we can't do this. We cannot do this. And one advisor, one admiral said, I'll put together a task force if you want me to. And she said, yeah, put it together. That's not so surprising. Of course she wanted to keep all the options open. What is surprising is she gave the orders to use it.
In 1984, National Mine Workers Union goes on strike. And let me quote you in There Is No Alternative, quote, Thatcher's response to this strike can be put in proper perspective only if we appreciate that Arthur Scargill, who was leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, only if we appreciate that Scargill was in fact committed to bringing about a communist revolution in Britain.
He was an out-and-out, unrepentant Marxist, and that was entirely his objective. And people told me that Scargill, when he woke up in the morning, when he was shaving himself, he said, one day you're going to be president of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Britain. Everything in his writings suggests this. Not just
he wasn't
Marxist,
striking for better
Stalinist.
wages. He wanted to bring Britain to a halt.
He's still a member of the British Stalinist Society, which actually exists. He still lectures in front of it.
So what did Mrs. Thatcher do? What was the terrible measure?
It wasn't just a terrible measure; it was a year of terrible measures. And this really brought Britain to the brink of civil war. And you have to understand that this union was controlling the British economy. This is the source of the energy that has been powering the British economy since the 19th century. You have to think of the miners' union. I think the relevant analogy is OPEC. Mm-hmm. That's why you have to understand the strategic significance of controlling the mines. The thing is, what people really have to understand is that the mines were no longer, the mines in question, the ones she wanted to close. Of course, many of the mines were still economical, but the ones she had proposed to close, over which the strike was called, they were not producing coal at a price that anyone in the world wanted to buy it for. And what Scargill was saying was, it doesn't matter. These mines need to stay open because they are providing jobs, and there should be, in his words, loss without limit. So the mines were supposed to function as a demented welfare system. I say demented because who on earth, if you're simply going to transfer money to needy people, who's going to transfer it on the basis of sending them down into... This is an incredibly dangerous job. It's a horrible job.
Just have them sit at home and take welfare payments if you want to do that.
Absolutely.
So in 1983, she wins the Falklands War. 1984, 1985, she actually wins. She breaks the strike.
Yeah.
The workers outvote against Scargill, and they vote to go back to work. She breaks the strike.
That's right.
She wrings inflation out of the British economy. She adjusts tax rates. She generally in the lower direction. She privatizes large swaths of British economy. And in 1990, when Mrs. Thatcher leaves 10 Downing Street, give me a portrait of Britain.
One of the wealthiest and most powerful countries in Europe.
Okay. Segment 2, how she did it. Let's begin with Mrs. Thatcher's personal qualities. And There Is No Alternative. You write about doing research, and you come across in a museum, you come across one of her handbags.
It wasn't a museum, it's the Thatcher Archives.
The Thatcher Archives.
Yeah.
And so they've got a box, you open the box, and there's a handbag, one of her handbags, and you write that you were surprised that it carried the scent of perfume, not, quote, napalm and gunpowder. Why is that, Claire? Tell me about this, Mrs. Thatcher as a person.
Well, here's one thing. I have never met her personally. When I began work on this book, she was already too ill. When you hear stories of her refracted through other people, you always hear how astonishing she was in person. Now, we were just talking on Ricochet, we were talking about the quality of political charisma. I've seen this in her on television. I have never actually been in the same room with her. Have you?
I have, yes.
Okay, so you might be able to tell me, I ask everyone who met her, what was it like?
Let me put it this way. You sat up a little straighter, and you made sure your fingernails were clean.
That's what
This
everyone
is
says.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. You wrote the book. Go ahead.
You can see this in interviews with journalists who are otherwise completely incapable of being intimidated, like David Frost, who's not someone who's easily intimidated. I mean,
right.
You see in his interviews with her that he's terrified, and that she's just steamrolling over him. She had, from everything I can tell, and of course I'm putting my portrait of her together from many, many different sources. But
your sources, what's one of the things that's so enjoyable about the book is that you do long interviews. Of course, you don't provide transcripts, but you have clearly done long interviews with people who knew her well over long periods of time.
Yeah.
You're going to sources who knew her.
Yeah. People say when she walked into the room, it was like a great diva coming on stage, and that she knew it, and she was full of presence. She bustled in, that the energy level just immediately rose in the room. The temperature seemed to go up. And she had that kind of star quality, and that she was terrifyingly impatient if she thought you were stupid or incompetent, but capable of extraordinary kindness as well, especially at a personal level. Personally very tolerant of her ministers' foibles, unless they were stupid or irritating.
John Hoskins, once again, quoted in There Is No Alternative, "She's not your ordinary, world-weary, pompous, self-important, thinking inside the box, slightly defeatist, pragmatic, cautious Tory politician." So you've already described that she's not that, but what he's describing is the background of figures against whom she seems so singular, figures in her own party.
Yeah.
All right, now, personal qualities, but also principles. You quote a speech in There Is No Alternative that Mrs. Thatcher delivered 2 years before becoming Prime Minister. This is a longish quotation, but it says a lot. Quote, "We must not focus our attention exclusively on the material, because though important, it is not the main issue. The economic success of the Western world is a product of its moral philosophy and practice. The economic results are better because the moral philosophy is superior. It is superior because it starts with the individual."
You pulled that quote out, and so did I, because that, I think, is the single most important thing to understand about Thatcherism, that it is not just free market economics. It's a belief about the redeeming moral value of freedom, which she believed should apply to economic life as it should to every other aspect of human life. She made the moral case for economic freedom, I think, more powerfully than any politician before, or, apologies, since.
You're trying to goad me into defending Ronald Reagan, but
I don't think we both love Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
Okay, we both love Ronald
these two are
Reagan.
these two are not on a reputational teeter-totter. It's not the case that when one is up, the other is down. They both
Reinforce
rise
each
together.
other. They go together. Okay. The difference between Thatcherism and free market economics is that when we talk about free market economics, we're talking about widgets and textbooks, and we're talking about optimal economic outcomes, and it's not just that. She is saying that man is an economic being who makes myriad economic choices over the course of his day, thousands and thousands of small economic choices. And to the degree that you take away his ability to choose, you are taking away his moral agency. You are taking away his free will, which is how we distinguish a moral being from this coffee cup. And it is really important to understand that this did come from a religious way of looking at mankind as someone who has fallen and makes choices between good and evil. And her view is a moral one, not just a technocratic one. And it is so deeply held.
She did not want to wrap her countrymen in more material goods. She wanted them to lead better lives.
Yeah.
That's what it came down to.
Yeah, she wanted them to be self-reliant, strong, productive, moral citizens. And she felt that socialism was absolutely incompatible with that.
Summary statement of how you place her. Let's get into it. Let me quote historian Jeffrey Elton. Quote, There are times when I incline to judge all historians by their opinion of Winston Churchill, whether they can see that he still remains, quite simply, a great man. Does Margaret Thatcher pose the same test?
To any historian who's looked carefully at her record, yeah, sure. If you can't look at Margaret Thatcher and conclude that she's a great woman, then yeah, there's something wrong with your historical acumen.
All right. Segment 3, why Margaret Thatcher matters. This lineup is irresistible. Margaret Thatcher and Barack Obama. Personal qualities. She'd eat him for lunch? Okay, that handles the personal qualities. What can we learn about her conduct of the Falklands War as compared with his conduct of the war on radical Islam?
I think this is a slightly unfair comparison because there is no state called there's no state called radical Islam.
All right.
Okay. Let's at least make sure we're comparing the same things. I mean, if we're talking about how does he prosecute wars,
let the record show that you take pains to be fair to Barack Obama. All right, go ahead.
I think that her resolution in saying, once we have made a decision that we're going to do this, failure is simply not an option, we will not discuss it, is a very important thing to consider, because this isn't just, it's not just admirable in a wasn't she strong way, it's also a question of signaling. It's also a hugely important question of signaling.
The title, There Is No Alternative, doesn't that come from an interview at the time of the Falklands War?
She said it throughout her career.
Oh, she did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was her slogan. It was Tina. This is something that she was really well known for saying.
There's a famous moment when a reporter says, well, but
failure is not an alternative.
Failure is not an alternative. Failure is not an alternative. All right.
A wartime leader really does have to project that failure is not an alternative. But when we're talking about the struggle with radical Islam, we're not talking about a war that can be won in quite the same way. We're talking about an ideology which is global, and we're not at war with a state with borders. So, but I think what you're getting at is, can you compare the resolution in the leadership and say that Barack Obama is lacking by comparison? Yeah, I can do that easily.
Well, so compare her saying failure is not an alternative to his speech from the Oval. In other words, can an American read this book and say, all right, I'm about to go to the polls in 9 weeks here, 8 or 9 weeks, and I'd like to look around for, I'd like to test the people, the candidates, against the Thatcher standard. And she says, victory, we're going to win. That's the way she conducted the conflict. And we have a commander-in-chief who's saying, well, we're going to get out in a certain, we already know the time at which our troops are going to start. It seems a little vague or a little looser. And should Americans be dissatisfied with that? Is that the lesson? Is that the applicability of the example of Margaret Thatcher?
One of them.
It is. All
yes,
right.
I agree that it is insane for a commander-in-chief to be saying we have, on X date we're out no matter what happens.
Okay.
Right? That's obviously insane, because it's common sense. Anyone watching that is going to think, okay, all we have to do is hold out until X date, and then we're fine.
Obviously sane.
Obviously.
Insane. Note to the White House, note to the National Security Council. You wrote recently, this is the question America faces right now. Should economies be free or planned?
Yeah, it is.
So that's just obvious, isn't it? I mean, now we are.
My answer?
Now yes, your answer.
Are you seriously asking me? Do I think they should? I think they should be free.
So, is there a Republican that you're aware of? Does the Republican Party just sort of, you live in Istanbul, so you're not going to be as up on this or that minor figure, but did you get the feeling from the Republican Party that they're saying that they understand Mrs. Thatcher's message?
Not nearly enough.
This is a moral matter. This is not a matter of pennies and dollars. This is a matter of the way we choose to live our lives.
First, let's remember this fire hose of spending did start into the Republicans. Mm-hmm. And I am not seeing the Republicans renounce this or apologize for this or accept this with anything like the forthrightness that they need. In fact, the Republican Party right now reminds me of the Conservative Party at the time Margaret Thatcher came to power.
I have to be fair, because the person who was in that seat just before you a couple of weeks ago was Haley Barbour, governor of Mississippi, chairman of the Republican Governors Association, and he effectively apologized. He said, we did this to ourselves. So there's one, but go ahead.
There are Republicans, and
Here and there.
Newt Gingrich has been very, very supportive of the book and has been telling people about it and speaking about it, which endears him to me enormously, obviously, and is saying this is exactly the message that the Republicans need to be embracing right now. I mean a Republican who
penetrates to Istanbul. All right.
yeah, I'm not hearing it said loudly enough, compellingly enough, and in a way that's really making it through to popular consciousness. Not just we did wrong, it started with us, but this has now gotten to the point where it's a genuine danger to the United States on both sides. I'm not hearing that.
Oh, there's one question that's just another inevitable question. Margaret Thatcher and Sarah Palin.
Yeah, it's an inevitable question, isn't it?
Is Sarah Palin, to what extent is Sarah Palin a Margaret Thatcher an embryo?
Well, she's a woman. She's from a small town. She's a conservative. And
Oh, you're not going to go any farther than that?
I don't think there is any further than that to go.
Oh, you don't?
No, I don't think
No,
there's
but
any
you
further
wrote
than that
something,
to go.
I can't remember where I saw it, but you wrote something, it was either on Ricochet or over at the City Journal. You wrote something on the web saying, I think you were giving her credit for tremendous intelligence and saying, now, however, before any real comparisons can be drawn between Sarah Palin and Margaret Thatcher, Sarah Palin needs to study up. Margaret Thatcher knew where she stood and she knew the issues in detail, and I see no evidence that Sarah Palin does.
Isn't that what I just said?
Well, yeah, but that suggests...
I don't see any further to go.
No, but that suggests she's working at it, that a year or two from now, say by 2012, or she's a young woman, by 2016, this is someone who could still be very Thatcher-like. She just has some studying to do, right?
Margaret Thatcher had a 20-year parliamentary career in which she clearly expressed every position relevant to Britain's political life, foreign policy, economy, in terms that were absolutely clear to anyone who wanted to consult them by the time anyone was seriously talking about her as a leader of the Conservative Party. No one was saying, well, in a few years maybe she'll have mastered this. She had mastered this all years before anyone was seriously talking about this. And we're talking about President of the United States at a time of unique geopolitical danger, at a time when the United States economy is in the worst shape it's been in since the Great Depression, and no one is even entirely sure why. We're talking about the world's last remaining superpower to which every other country is looking for signals, for hope, for leadership. And we're talking about putting someone who might be prepared in 2016 in office? Are you serious? Where are the adults? I don't want someone who might be prepared in 2016 to even be spoken about as the possible president of the United States right now.
All right, Claire. There is no alternative why Margaret Thatcher matters. We now put the Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven aside for now and go on to segment 4, Turkey. By the way, a decade in Istanbul? Is that right?
5 years.
5 years in Istanbul. Okay, 5
It can
years
feel like
in
a
Istanbul.
decade sometimes.
5 years in Istanbul. So here's the threshold question. You've been commenting on Turkey, obviously. You've been reporting from Turkey. And here we sit in California. Convince me that Turkey matters to an American.
It's kind of hard to believe when you're sitting here in California,
It is hard to
doesn't
believe.
it? I mean, California, it's sunny out, and the roads, there's no traffic, and Turkey
Turkey's
just
a long
seems
way away.
so far away and kind of abstract, like it doesn't really exist. I get it why no one's listening. Yeah, but actually it does, and actually it's geostrategically absolutely vital. And Americans who are asking themselves this question, as I think almost every American is, from what I can tell, about what the West's relationship with the Islamic world is going to be, and what it means when you say moderate Islam, whether we have friends in that part of the world, are they deep friendships? Everyone who's concerned about these issues should be looking at what's going on in Turkey right now with real interest, should be looking and saying, what is this?
Because you argue that Turkey is a test case in some way, right?
In some ways. In some ways it is, but in other ways you have to understand that Turkey is just different from the rest of the Islamic world and always has been. So it's a mistake to look at it as simply part of this big community of identical Islamic states.
Right.
That's
it's not
absolutely
Arab
wrong.
in the first place,
It's
right?
certainly
so there's
not. It's
a
certainly
ethnic background difference.
Linguistic, different traditions of governance, different. I won't say it's not different. It's not different everything, because of course it is profoundly influenced by the Arab world and by the Persian world, but it is a very different country.
Okay, so here's why the layman might think of Turkey as a test case, because Ataturk in the 20s or 30s, I'm even off by a decade. When was
23.
Okay, Ataturk, the great Turkish leader, establishes a secular state, and he effectively puts one of the few places, if not indeed the only place, where you get a protracted period of decades where there really is a separation in the Islamic world between mosque and state. He draws the distinction. No?
He brought the mosque under control of the state.
Under the control of the state.
Yeah, certainly, and not. It wasn't easy either. It's not quite fair to say that there's a separation of mosque and state. There's a subordination of mosque to state.
All right, so you've corrected me.
Right.
So let me continue. You correct me as I need to continue to be corrected. Yeah. And he wants his country to embrace Western-style modernity. He wants to enter an economy that is, or to create an economy that is productive, industrial, and so forth. And this seems to work for decade after decade after decade. And now Turkey seems to be becoming more radically Islamic and less secular. It all seems to be slipping away. There was a Turkey we could deal with, where it was even plausible for years at a time that it could be brought into the European Union.
Okay, the way of looking at it that you've just narrated is, I'm finding it very common in the U.S., but it's not quite right, and there are some important ways that it's not right.
All right.
The first is you say it seems to work. Yeah, definitely. If you compare Turkey, its economic growth, its the level of development with any of its Arab neighbors, it works great. I mean, Turkey compared to Iraq. But don't forget, 3 military coups. Many people died in those coups. They were not bloodless. And an authoritarian country where civil liberties were very fragile and are still very fragile. This is not a perfect Western democracy by any stretch of the imagination. And the problems that the AKP describes, the AKP being the Turkish ruling party right now, the problems...
AKP stands for?
Justice and Development.
All right, in Turkish.
And it's a pun in Turkish because ak means white, which means clean, and supposedly they were the anti-corruption party.
All right.
The problems that they described were not totally trivial when they said that in this country, even though 99% of us are Muslims, we can't wear a headscarf. Our daughters or our wives can't go to a university in a headscarf because it's illegal. That's not right. You could do that in the United States, right? So it was not a completely workable separation of mosque and state. It was never going to be, that was never going to work forever. What you're seeing now is not really, in my view, a move toward Islamization in the sense that the Iranian Revolution was a move toward Islamization. What you're seeing are the inherently authoritarian tendencies of the Turkish political system, which is not and has never been fully democratic, married to Islamism or Islamism and pan-Turkic nationalism at the same time. And the difference may sound subtle, but it's really important, and people who are making policy toward Turkey need to really understand it. Because if you look at this as Iranian Revolution Take Two, you're not going to get what the problem is. And it's too easy to have someone stand back and say, no, it's not Iranian Revolution Take Two. Look at this. I mean, there's no stonings in the public square. You're not seeing amputations. What are you talking about? You're being hysterical. What you really need to look at is that the government has been, for the past several years at least, more and more authoritarian, with a greater and greater contraction of press freedom, with more and more of its opponents in jail on charges that don't make any sense, with the institutions of civil society not becoming stronger, and in fact, in many cases, becoming more frayed, hugely divided population, and divided among supporters of the AKP and enemies of the AKP, and rising tension between Turks and Kurds, which is scary. It's very, very frightening, the kinds of things
because
I'm hearing.
That becomes violent easily. That conflict.
It not becomes, it is. It's a civil war which has claimed 40,000 lives. And
New York Times, June 8th, 2010, quote, leaders of Russia, Turkey, and Iran convened a security summit meeting in Istanbul on Tuesday in a display of regional power that appeared to be calculated to test the United States. So Turkey is moving into an anti-American bloc?
It's already in one. It voted against the sanctions package on Iran in the United Nations.
So they're against us? Hard against us.
Not hard against us at all. It could easily go in another direction. But right now, I get the feeling that no one in Turkey believes the United States is paying attention, because they're not.
The United States is not.
Yeah, the United States is not really paying attention to what's going on. So I think people are feeling, in policymaking circles in Turkey, we can play both sides. We can play both sides. We can get away with this, and no one in the U.S. is going to step back and say, no.
Okay. Segment 5. What's a radical? On Ricochet recently, you've been sticking up for the idea, the existence, the importance of moderate Muslims. Quote, quoting you, Claire, the distinction between radical and moderate Islam must be drawn if we are to avoid radicalizing the moderates. Close quote. How do you draw the distinction?
If we were sitting here with friends of mine who are moderate Muslims, they would join this discussion enthusiastically, and they would not want to shut the conversation down. But I think the main, you can look at it.
So freedom of speech or comfort with the notion of free exchange of ideas, argument,
The main thing is that the vehicle for communicating difference, if you're dealing with I don't like the term moderate, because it sounds like these people are not genuinely religious, and that's not true. You can have someone who is as passionately religious as a radical, but who does not believe it.
Go ahead. I will return to that point, but go ahead.
But the main difference is that difference of agreement is settled through discussion, not through violence.
Okay.
Violence is the key thing that you need to look at. And when you talk about crypto radicals, you need to look at people who are in some way supporting those who are violent, either by glossing it over or by apologizing for it. But there is, in my view, a difference between Al-Qaeda and
your neighbors.
Well, of course there's a difference between Al-Qaeda and my neighbors. I mean, what am I going to be living amid neighbors who believe in Al-Qaeda? Of course not. Of course not. But I'm talking about, we've been having this discussion on Ricochet about Muslims who seem to be moderate, but then when you peel away the surface and you see who they're hanging out with and what you're thinking, well, that's not that moderate, and what does that really mean? Well, there is a difference between Muslims who are in that gray area of maybe having some friends that we're not very comfortable with, and Al-Qaeda.
Okay. A couple of quotations now. Here's one.
But we nonetheless need to call that what it is, too.
And again, this is getting to the question of what is a moderate Muslim. Rule Mark Garect. Actually, I got this. You quoted him, so I'm giving you back a quote. This is Rule Mark Garect. Quote, a moderate Muslim is someone who unqualifiedly renounces the applicability of the Sharia, the holy law, in American society. That's a very clear, simple test. I will live by the laws, by the criminal laws of the state of New York, say, and not seek secretly to submit myself instead to the Sharia. Hold on, that's quotation one, and here's quotation two. Mark Stein, writing in his book America Alone. There are moderate Muslims, but there is no moderate Islam. And Mark goes on to point out that all the major juridical branches of Islam insist on Sharia. So what do you do with that? Here's
the problem. When you start using words like Sharia and jihad, you're always going to get someone who says, but that's not the proper translation. Right?
Well,
I don't think we should not be in the business of trying to interpret the Quran and say what these words mean or should mean. It's very clear. Do you abide by the laws of the United States? Do you abide by the spirit and the letter of the laws of the United States? And do you think do you think the Constitution should be the Constitution of
precisely
that governs over you?
Right.
Let's not get into the word Sharia. Let's just say, do you accept our laws? Do you accept our Constitution?
Right.
That's your test right there.
Right. But Mark is making the point that excuse me, I don't want to put words into his mouth, so let me make the argument just to test you on it. But you were saying a moderate Islam, you don't like the word because it suggests they can't be religious. But that's precisely the point he's making.
Yeah.
But I believe that the extent to which a Muslim is faithful, delves deeply, reads deeply in his own religion, to that extent he'll be drawn toward a rejection of American law in a favor of, I can't use the word Sharia now because I've agreed to not to use it. That to the extent to which a Muslim is moderate, that Muslim does not take his religion as seriously.
No, it means that he's decided that the way that the religion ought to be interpreted is different from someone who has decided to emphasize those parts of the Quran which are, or the ways of interpreting the Quran which are uniquely.
Okay.
I mean, of course, you can interpret any text in many, many different ways. I'm not just saying this to be postmodern. I'm not saying this because I'm influenced by fashionable leftist trends. There is no such thing as a text you can't interpret in multiple ways, and this is especially
but
true.
in Islam there sure is, in the sense that there are specific schools, and if your imam says this is what this text means, there's no doubt that in Islam a lot of people sign up and say, yes, sir, that's what it means, right?
What's your point?
The point there
with that?
the point there is that there are leaders in Islam that we can look at schools of thought. It's not infinite. It's not. Islam is not constructed like the English department at a liberal arts college where everybody gets to deconstruct Robert Frost as he chooses. It's not like that.
Okay, let's separate the questions. The first is a moderate Islam philosophically possible? The second is,
yes,
is
right.
it the dominant strain?
Okay, so your answer A is definitely it is. Is that right?
Of course it's philosophically possible. And second, yes, there are moderate Muslims.
Okay, which leads me to Bernard Lewis.
Whether there are many of them, that is actually the important question that we need to be asking ourselves.
Bernard Lewis, writing earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, quote, a form of moderation has been a central part of Islam from the very beginning, writes this great scholar of Islam. For the moment, there does not seem to be much prospect of a moderate Islam in the Muslim world. This is partly because in the prevailing atmosphere, the expression of moderate ideas can be dangerous, even life-threatening. Close quote. Not much prospect of a moderate Islam. From Bernard Lewis himself, the leading scholar of Islamic culture and belief. What do you do with that? He's right?
It depends where. There certainly is in Turkey.
There is still prospect.
Of course there is in Turkey. Would I be...
You say of course as if I'm...
Do you think I'm suicidal? I live there. Would I be there if I lived there?
Yeah, but the question we're asking really is the trajectory. Or here's the demographic argument, right?
Yeah.
You've got this modernized elite in Turkey centered in the two urban centers, Istanbul and Ankara. And you've got a huge Anatolian peninsula outside Ankara, which is the size roughly of New England and New York and Pennsylvania. It's big. And it's broadly speaking rural, and it is conservative in outlook, and it has a higher birth rate than the modernized elites of Ankara and Istanbul. And so on demographics alone, Turkey's going to drift in the wrong direction in coming years.
That's assuming that these Anatolian villagers are radicals, and they're not. I mean, that's
You reassure me.
Yeah. I mean, they could be radicalized. Everyone could be radicalized, I suppose, but that's not traditionally what they... And most people in these areas want economic... I mean, they voted for the AKP for economic reasons. The polls show that overwhelmingly. They want economic stability in Turkey. They want to be able to feel proud of their country. They want to be able to send... I mean, they want to be able to send their daughters to school wearing a headscarf if that's... Well, I mean, the polls show that probably 60% want that. And they really aren't that politically sophisticated. They really aren't. And no, they don't want to be the next Iran, not at all. And they don't want to be like the Arabs either, not at all.
So American voters go to the polls on November 2nd. A proudly patriotic, America-loving American, but in Claire Berlinski, someone who observes the country from abroad. What would you most like to say to Americans to bear in mind as they cast their ballots?
Economic freedom.
Economic freedom. Back to Mrs. Thatcher.
Yeah, back to Mrs. Thatcher. Without economic freedom, there can be no economic growth. Without economic growth, there can be nothing else.
All right. Journalist, essayist, and the author most recently of There Is No Alternative, Why Margaret Thatcher Matters, just out in paperback. Claire Berlinski, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thank you for joining us.